So, welcome to the first episode of the Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm Neal Spackman, I'm your host today, and I'm also going to be the main presenter today, although that's not going to be the case for following episodes. And I'm going to tell you first about how I got to do this kind of work of terraforming or restoring productivity to deserts. When I graduated from college in 2006 with a degree in Arabic and Middle East Studies, and I got a job monitoring media out of the Arab world and writing reports about current events. And then we had a series of subscribers who would pay for our material. And it was, it was okay. It wasn't what I want to do with my life. I had a little cubicle, and I really wanted to get into, I was very interested in sustainability, in building regenerative systems. And I was preparing, by 2009, I was preparing to quit that job and go intern with Yanto Evans at Cobb Cottage Company in Southern Oregon. Because I was initially interested in natural building, more so than I was in land use and water use and agricultural systems. But it was my hobby to read about sustainability, and I really liked the stuff coming out of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Natural Capitalism was a book that strongly influenced me, as was Cradle to Cradle by McDonough. And while I was preparing to quit, a contact of mine came and said, we're looking at a project in Saudi Arabia where we're going to try to build a village for settled nomads who are living in poverty and figure out how they can make a living on their land. And we need somebody who knows the culture, who knows the language, who's willing to work with people, and who's a quick learner and can help figure all the other stuff out. And they hadn't found anybody to do it. And so I submitted an application and went through a very long interviewing process. And I got the job. And so in September of 2010, I quit my cubicle job to go and move and to try to do this work in Saudi Arabia, working with settled nomads, to help them build systems that they can make a living off of, and help teach the people these kinds of skills that they would need to be self-sustaining. And we, as part of that process, I said, I really need to get a permaculture design certificate so that I can have a better grasp of the land and the water use and what our potential is. And so I went and took a PDC with Jeff Lawton in Jordan in October of 2010. So they flew me to Saudi Arabia for a week, and then I went to Jordan and studied with Jeff Lawton at PRI for 2 weeks. And the PDC was a fantastic experience for me. I'm still in touch with a lot of those people. And at the end, I felt like I had a better mental grasp of what we would be attempting in Saudi Arabia. But I felt very inexperienced. I had no practice in this kind of work. And so we were able to bring Jeff to Saudi Arabia as a consultant very early on. It was immediately following the PDC. So in this picture, you see me and Jeff, and we're picking out the demonstration site where I've been working for the past 5 years. And I had him to myself for 10 days. And in those 10 days, it was like a very, very fast apprenticeship where I got to see his methods and the processes he goes through when designing as a professional rather than just teaching it to students in a classroom. And that experience for me gave me enough confidence and gave me a view into somebody who had years and years of experience doing this. And that has been enough to keep me going up to this point where I felt like I had the tools I needed to tackle this project. as a designer and as one of the leaders for the project. And what we're trying to do with Sustainable Design Masterclass is duplicate that experience in a virtual setting for lots and lots of people. So the goal for all of this is to help people who say, I want to do this kind of work, to help you move from being a want-to-do to somebody who actually can do it and has, you know, a way in. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have webinars where professionals and experts are going to design live with a client, taking on a very unique scenario, and everyone's going to be able to watch that. And then they can say, oh, this is how they do it. And hopefully with enough people and enough climates and enough scenarios, it's going to give the people who want to pursue this kind of thing that kind of access to the experts, that kind of being able to watch how somebody who already knows what they're doing go through this process. That's what we're trying to do for Sustainable Design Masterclass. And we're just getting started. We're really excited about it. So today's episode is 10 keys for greening any desert. And these are largely principles of how I've gone about my work here. This is a view of the site where I've been working, taken from the top of our watershed about 3 months ago. And we're going to go through this process of how do we go about doing it? What's the right way, given the context that you have? So here's a few shots of the work that we've done. This was a water harvesting technique that we first started to dig and prepare in early 2011. So you can see that we've got this contour ditch for harvesting water. We had started to mulch. It successfully caught rain in January of 2011, which was how we initially established a starting water budget. And then we planted them. We were able to measure how much water we could catch by looking at the water level, and then we know how wide these swales are, how deep they are. We can measure how much water we've caught. And then this is my friend Ali with trees that he planted in November of 2012 or December of 2012. And this is him next to those trees about 2 months ago in August of 2015. All right, so we've seen massive changes. And then here's another before and after shot where on the left is just this bare rock foothill. And the angle is slightly different, but this is exactly the same place. Some of those rocks are the same rocks in that picture. And through looking at different aspects of water and soil and anti-evaporative strategies, we've been able to create this system that's productive, that is evolving into a silvopasture system, meaning a forest-based grazing system, while using less water than what we've caught off of our earthworks. And that was the goal as a proof of concept. And we're very happy. I'm very happy with the progress we've seen on the site and what's been going on. Let me show you real quick what that looks like on Google Earth. This is our site. Before we started, this is from January 8th of 2010. Here's the date. So our site comprises this dry riverbed right here, this ridge all the way down to here, and then we have this dry riverbed as well. All right, so that's what it looked like when we started. You can see there's a number of trees along where the water flows are. And this is what it looks like as of February of 2015, or January of 2015. So there's a large number of earthworks, a large number both up in the mountain and down in the floodplain. All right. This site is about 600 meters wide and 800 meters from the ridge down to where the water leaves our site, which is this little gateway right down here. Okay, so by working with the local people, we hired them to build these systems under my supervision. And so they have learned how to build these, how to manage their water, and how to start regreening this piece of the desert. And all these little dots are trees that have been planted. Okay, now I'm going to show you what that looks like in video. And if you've seen this already, you're going to see it again. Pay attention to this tree, because that's one of the landmarks. Another landmark is this white building right here. Okay, this is when we had laid out where our water harvesting swales were going to be dug, but before we actually dug any. And we laid them out in stone so that the people could visualize what a contour line looked like, and also so that the machine operator could have a really, really easy path to follow. All right, and this mountain up here and these little mountains in the foreground are also a good landmark for when you watch the second half of this. Okay, so that's a scan of our site in 2010. This tree, if you can see my cursor, that's the same tree you saw in the beginning of the video. All right, it's an acacia. It's surrounded by some Pithecolobium trees right now, and we've planted since this video was taken. But here's what it looks like now. Okay, here's that white building. Here's that mountaintop. Here's that little foreground mountain. Here's the headquarters that we built. And then that mountain face there has been turned into those terraces right along here. Okay, so that's a pretty good view of where we are right now and what we've been able to accomplish on a macro scale. So here are the 10 keys that looking back, that I've come up with that I think should allow you to green any desert, given the limitations on your site formed, by your water sources, by the size of your land, by where you fall in your watershed. Here are the 10 keys. You have to know your original climate. You have to know your water and your mineral cycles. You have to know where your niche is in your watershed. You need to understand precipitation versus evaporation and what that means for you. Anti-evaporative measures, species selection, timing, creating microclimates, and enabling ecological succession. Okay, so let's go through these. This is pretty dense, and it's very sciencey. So hold your questions to the end and we'll get to it. Key number 1, know your original climate. When we're talking about deserts, there's a tendency to conflate deserts and dry lands with areas that actually shouldn't be desert or dry lands but are undergoing desertification, whether through natural processes that were catalyzed by human activity or whether directly through human activity. Human-driven desertification tends to follow these 3 patterns. Starting off with deforestation. Deforestation has a lot of negative effects on the ecology, including lower rainfall, greater erosion, greater soil loss, as well as an inability of the soil to absorb as much water as it can. Usually when we cause deforestation, it's to plant crops, and irrigation when we plant crops leads to aquifer depletion and soil salinization. So as we irrigate over time, the land becomes less and less capable of supporting plant life. And then finally, we have overgrazing, which is widespread and leads to soil and plant destruction. Okay, so this is desertification as caused by people people-based activities. Then with deserts, deserts on the macro scale are largely caused by Hadley cycles, which I'll get to, or they can be caused by rain shadows, which is where you have a mountain that is catching all the rain on one side of the mountain, but none of the rain falls on the other side, and that other side is referred to as a rain shadow. You folks watching that are in eastern Washington or eastern Oregon where it's very dry, that's because you're in a rain shadow. And there are other major geological features that can contribute to a natural desert. But those are the two big ones. Now, a Hadley cycle is caused by the tilt of the Earth, where because the equator is so hot all the time, the air heats up, the air goes up into the atmosphere, and as that air rises, it causes a belt of rain to fall, within 30 degrees of the equator on both sides. But when you get beyond that, because you have that toroidal effect, that torus that's going around the equator, you also get these very dry areas that start just on the lower part of that Hadley cycle. So that cycle is called the Hadley cycle, and that's why deserts around the Earth kind of form a belt. That belt of desert is caused by the Hadley cells. Okay? That doesn't mean that we can't affect those deserts, and that doesn't mean that we can't work within them to create productive systems. But we have to understand both the macro cycles going on as well as the micro cycles and the human-driven changes that we see. Okay? And here, these are questions that I think are useful for me when I'm looking at a site is, what would this site or what would this climate be without human intervention? If people didn't exist, what would this look like? All right? And oftentimes we can already see what it looks like under current human-driven systems. And I see people as miners, but it's not mining in the sense of minerals, it's mining in the sense that through agriculture, that we mine the soil, okay? We deplete it as we use it up in our agricultural systems. Okay, and then it's useful to also think, what would the climate be like if people systems were driven more as stewardship? Or the more useful question, or the one I like to ask is, what would this land look like? Or what does this land want to be if we cooperate with it? If we cooperate with it, what's the potential that this site can give us? And that's very hard to know unless you know your original climate. Now, how can you tell what your original climate is? One of the techniques that I use is you look at major geological features. If you're around mountains or hills, it's really useful to look at what shape these form. And this picture isn't very clear, but you can tell that the landforms are very jagged, very rocky, very angular. And what that tells us is that any soil that was on top of these washed away a long time ago. So it's been a desert for a long time. To contrast that, here are two photos from a consultation that David Spicer did in Morocco earlier this month in November and October of this year in 2015. And when you look at these pictures, that very much looks like a dry desert kind of environment where you've got plant life down in the riverbed, but it's very dry, lots of erosion going on. But if you look at the shape of the hills, those hills are very round. They're not angular, they're not jagged, they're not rocky. There's still soil up there. Okay, so when I look at these, my guess is that this land used to be forest, probably within the last 150 years. And earlier today, I talked with David on Facebook, and I asked him, I said, how long have people been using this land? And he said, it's been 80 years. He said 100 years ago, these hills were all cork oak forest 100 years ago. And 80 years ago, people started to move here. They were pushed out by growing cities, and they wanted to get out in the country. And so there has been desertification here, largely caused by wood cutting and grazing. But you can tell looking at the landform that this was recently heavily vegetated because the shapes are very round, very curvy. All right, so that's one technique that you can use to know kind of what the original climate could have been or would have been as you look at the shape of the major landforms. Okay, the second key is you need to know your water cycle. And this is essentially, it's where does your water come from and where is your water going and how often does that happen? And it helps to know when it rains where you are, what are the conditions that cause that rain to fall? Is your rain coming because you're in a location that experiences orographic lift? Is your rainfall generally coastal driven? Or is it a result of some other macro cycle going on? Or does most of your precipitation come through condensation? Or are you next to some kind of river system where you have access to that runoff? Okay, and then the other question is, where is your water going? Is it running off of your system? Is it running into the sea? Or contrarily, is it evaporating or is it sinking into the ground? Okay, so these are the questions that are really helpful to have answers to when you start designing. Okay, what's the longest time you go without precipitation? Between May and August, but it reliably rains the rest of the months, at least a little, then you know what the longest gap you have to deal with is. Whereas in my climate, where I am, we had no rain between January of 2011 and January of 2014. We had no rain at all for 3 years. And so that dramatically affects how you're going to approach managing your water, okay? If you're using groundwater, if you're relying on wells, what's the recharge rate of your aquifer and how many other people are tapping into that, right? Because likelihood is your aquifer is being drained for other agricultural activities, and that's not going to be a reliable source for you down the road. If you really want to build a sustainable or a regenerative system, you should not be relying on groundwater unless you have control of that watershed and you can assure that you're putting more into your aquifer than you're taking out. All right? Second, and then finally, you want to know what's the intensity of the kind of rain that you get in the last 150 years or as far back as you can find. What's been the largest rainfall event in 24 hours? Because your system should be able to absorb that kind of shock. Okay, and that's what it is. It's when you get a massive rainfall, it's a shock to your system. So a resilient system is going to be able to absorb that shock and then put that rain to use. When you're forming a water budget, this is the hard and fast rule. Every square meter of land that you have receiving 1 millimeter of rain is equivalent to 1 liter of water. All right, and the simple example here is if you got a 3-acre homestead on 8 inches of rain per year, and that's quite similar to the folks of you who are in the Southwest who are getting 8 to 12 inches a year. On a 3-acre homestead with 8 inches of rain, your total water on your site is just under 2.5 million liters per year, and that's your limit. If you're using more than that, it needs to be coming from runoff further up your watershed, or you're going to be draining an aquifer. Okay, so that's how you find your total water budget. You look at your site, the size, your average rainfall, and you say, okay, this is our total water, and we shouldn't be using more than this. And part of figuring that out is also understanding percolation rates and runoff ratios. So depending on your soil type, depending on your vegetative cover, depending on what kind of scape you have in your land, you know, your runoff could be 100% if you're on solid stone, or on any kind of hardscape. And the other thing that depends on is the intensity of the rain, which you measure in millimeters per hour. Okay, so getting 25 millimeters per hour, 1 inch of rain in an hour, is way different than getting 1 inch of rain over a 10-hour drizzle. Okay, so that intensity is also going to help determine what kind of runoff you would expect to happen on your site. And understanding that part of it helps you decide how you shape your land to manage that catchment, to manage that kind of intensity. Key number 3, you need to understand your mineral cycle. I use nutrient cycle and mineral cycle independently, even though phosphorus has its own cycle, nitrogen has its own cycle, and the deeper you get into the science, the more separate they become. But this is the basic thing. Now, in a desert, the nutrient cycle tends to be broken, and the more intense your desert is, the more broken this nutrient cycle is. And it's broken because of this. Now, this is a camel that was by the side of the road, and I remember it got hit by a car, and they moved it to the side of the road. And this is a picture of what it looked like 3 years later after that accident. Okay, in dry lands, because the air is so dry and the land is so dry, there's so little moisture, normal biodegradation doesn't happen. Things don't biodegrade. What they do is they tend to dry up and blow away. So when you have that happening, all of the minerals, the calcium in all those bones, all the nutrients in this camel body are not available for plant life to take up because biodegradation is not happening. Okay, so the mineral cycle is broken, your nutrient cycle is broken. And you have to mimic on your system, you have to mimic a healthy mineral cycle so that you can get soil life going. So there are key species that can help you do this that you want to attract to your site. In grasslands, it's grazers because grasslands and grazers evolve together. But in true deserts, places like where I'm working, it's termites, it's ants, it's dung beetles, and lots of other little burrowing creatures that take all this organic material, take it underground and eat it. And then all that organic matter is already underground by the function of these different animals. And it was the esteemed Bill Mollison who said, the termite is to the desert what the worm is to humid lands. The termite is your primary decomposer. So just as much as earthworms form a huge part in developing soil life, termites do that in deserts as well. And there are other animals aside from termites and these kinds of things that you can attract that can help to get this mineral cycle going on a large scale. Okay, so this is how I put this. In terraforming, you need to mimic a functioning mineral cycle and encourage key species that perform biodegradation to inhabit your site. And I'll show you a couple examples of that later on. A complete mineral cycle leads to soil creation, which leads to increased habitat for restorative species, and that's the foundation for afforestation in deserts. That's how we start to turn a desert into a savanna or into a forest on a limited basis. Of course, all of that depends on figuring the water out, but after you've got your water figured out, you've got to figure out your mineral cycle and how you're going to mimic a healthy mineral cycle. Okay? Key number 4, I think we're on 4, find your niche in the watershed. This is a picture of every watershed on the planet because watersheds are fractals. They all follow the same dendritic pattern. And so where you are on this watershed helps determine what you're going to do with your water. If you're at the top of your watershed, you know you can't depend on any kind of runoff coming onto your site. And that's a really big deal. Whereas if you're lower in the watershed, you might be subject to other people using that water in ways that aren't going to help you. Knowing where you fall in your watershed, and that watershed might be tiny. It might be your 1/10 of an acre house. where you don't get any runoff onto your 1/10 of an acre. In fact, the water from your roof and the water from your yard is running into a street or running into a drainage system. Okay, that's still a watershed. It's just a really small one. So this fractal, which is called a dendritic pattern or a dendritic fractal, this is found in lots of different places within nature, because this is how Mother Nature does collection, transportation, and distribution. Okay, so that picture, which it's not really very sharp right now, but that could be a picture of your blood system. It could be a picture of a cabbage leaf. It could be a picture of what your lungs look like. It could be a picture of a massive watershed. That could be the the head of the Mississippi watershed. They're all going to look like some variation of this fractal, because what this fractal does for nature is it collects water, or it collects oxygen, or it collects blood, or it collects things that transport energy, and then it transports it, and then it distributes that. Okay, so understanding that this fractal is what every watershed looks like can help you picture where you fall in that and what kind of access you have to runoff, or if what falls on your side is the only thing you've got. So something that's really, really useful is understanding your ratio of runoff to productivity. So farmers in the Negev, thousands of years ago, the Negev Desert, which is in southern Israel, they averaged less than 50 millimeters of rain per year. Okay, that's 2 inches. But they grew plums and apricots and peaches and grapes and forage. They were legitimate farmers, before the age of industrialization. And the way they did it was they managed runoff coming from their watershed, and they would have 80 hectares of land dedicated to just collecting runoff. And all of that runoff would go to 1 hectare, and that hectare was managed very intensively managed. And because they were able to do that, they could have legitimate farms in this really, really extreme climate. We're producing moringa oil and pith pods. We're starting to produce mesquite flour, and we're introducing grazing animals this month. Our runoff ratio to productivity is 5:2. So if you were to split our whole site into 7 parts, 5 of those parts are dedicated just to collecting runoff, and that's what our mountains do for us. And 2 of those are dedicated to productivity, okay, to the actual farming. So if you don't have access to runoff coming off of your site and then onto your site, as an input, then you have to look at your site as a whole watershed, and you say, okay, where do I want runoff to go? And so you determine your areas of runoff and your areas of productivity. If your water budget isn't enough to, it shouldn't say to regret the whole area, if your water budget isn't enough to convert that whole area into a productive landscape. Okay, so your ratio of runoff to your ratio of productivity is really important. And the more rain you get, of course, the more you've got to work with, and the smaller that ratio can be. But it also depends on the types of things you want to produce. Because my moringa trees need 5 liters of water per week for irrigation, whereas a date palm needs 40 liters of water per day. Okay, so for every date palm I were to grow, I could do 56 moringa trees. All right, and so that's an issue of managing your water and maximizing your crop per drop rather than maximizing your production per hectare. All right, what you want to focus on is crop per drop. Here's a picture of one of those very old farms in the Negev. It's not clear, but you can tell that the stuff in the middle used to be farm, and there are still trees there, and the surrounding area is entirely desolate. And they would manage their water coming off of those mountains in the background and centralize all of that runoff into one place at a ratio of 80 to 1. And that's how they did their farms. All right, key number 5, precipitation versus evaporation. This is kind of how you can determine how extreme your situation is, okay? In Death Valley, California, they get their evaporation rate is 128 inches, and the precipitation rate is 1.66. So their ratio of evaporation to precipitation is 77. And I believe that that's the highest in the world. In Albeda, our ratio is 43. And I can't say if that means that we're almost, half as hard as Death Valley would be. That's not what this is. It's just something that helps you to think about how extreme your situation is. In Moab, Utah, the ratio is only, it's almost 5, as opposed to Death Valley where it's 77. And I'd be interested in those of you who are participating live with us, if during the question and answer session, if you could look up what's your ratio of evaporation to precipitation, and see if anyone's doing something that's higher than Albeda, or if anyone's got anything higher than Death Valley. I'm just interested, where are we at with this? Because this kind of helps you to think about how hard of a job you've got in front of you. Because the main principle to greening a desert is to increase your functional precipitation and decrease your evaporation until that ratio is flipped. When your precipitation is greater than your evaporation, you're not in a desert anymore. And that doesn't take into account the evapotranspiration off of your plants, because the evapotranspiration has a much different effect on your climate than evaporation off of bare soil does. Okay? So if we're trying to decrease evaporation and increase precipitation, we have to take anti-evaporative measures. That's our next key. Now, a researcher at California Polytechnic University found that 5 centimeters of mulch decreased soil evaporation by 40%. 10 centimeters brought it up to 50%, but more than that, more than 10 centimeters of mulch didn't really make that much difference. Okay, so mulch is a big deal because it cuts your evaporation in half. And there was no difference between what different types of mulch they used. The other thing you need wind breaks. Wind is a major cause of evaporation. Shade, if you're north of the equator, then shade on your southern side of your plants and the western side of your plants. Or if you're south of the equator, then shade on the north and the west are going to bring down your evaporation a lot, because that's where the sun is hottest. And again, it doesn't matter what kind of mulch you're using. It can be rock mulch, straw mulch, wood chips, living vine mulch. The important mulch is a huge anti-evaporative measure. So in this picture, you've got a sapling, and there's rock mulch on the west, and then straw mulch surrounding that tree. What those rocks are doing is they're shading the root ball of that plant at the times when the sun is hottest, okay? But the other thing that those rocks do is they also help to maintain moisture that comes off of that drip irrigation line that you can see, all right? So through this, we're decreasing evaporation a great deal. And as that tree grows up, it's going to increase more and more and more. Air wells. This is a picture of a, it's not a complete air well. We built this up to be about twice as tall as this, and it's still experimental. But in places where you have a high temperature gradient between the day and the nighttime, and where you have humidity, air wells can both increase precipitation and decrease in evaporation. They increase precipitation by having greater surface area that's cooler than the dew point, so that humid air can condense on the inside of those air wells. And they decrease evaporation by increasing shade and covering the ground. Okay, so in some contexts, an air well or a mini air well can do a lot, but they're also very labor intensive. Here's a picture of the last site of catchment on our site in Albeda. So when we first got rain, there are only 3 trees in this picture that existed before we showed up, okay? And you can't see my cursor, but there's an acacia in the middle of the screen and a bit to the right. Okay, that one was there, and there are two other ones that are more like shrubs. But when we first got rain and we caught rain on this site, there were no trees here. And this looked a bit like a pool of water, or like, it just looked like bare land with water sitting on it. And some people who were commenting on this said, that water is just going to evaporate, you know, which is true. Some of that water is going to evaporate. But after we catch water there, a lot of that water sinks in, and then we can plant trees on it. And as these trees develop, you're increasing your shade, you're increasing your ground cover, you're breaking your wind. And so every time it rains, less and less of that water evaporates. More and more of it sinks into the ground. So the system actually increases in efficiency as it develops. Okay, it's more able to harvest water as it develops. All right. Next key is species selection. And the foundation for all of this, once you've got your water figured out, once you've got your water cycle your mineral cycle figured out, you've got to look at trees. Trees are the ultimate anti-evaporative element. But aside from that, in locations where you can go a long time without water, trees can go dormant and survive for a very long time. There's a ziziphus in the middle of this picture. This is on a check dam that we built. And then we planted this ziziphus as a sapling 3.5 years ago. And we watered it for a month. Every day someone climbed up the mountain to where this ziziphus is and watered it every day for a month. And then we left it alone. And after that month of watering, it did not get rain between 2012 and January of 2014. So it was a sapling. It got no rain, no water for 18 months. It was just what was there in the check dam. And I took this picture a month ago, or 2 months ago, I think in September of 2015, and it's grown about 8 inches, okay? 2.5 years with no water, and it's grown 8 inches. You can't do that with grasslands. You can't do that with anything except for trees, okay? So you've got to look at tree systems. Now, the species that you select are going to be determined by your climate analog. And I wrote a blog post on how to build a climate analog, but I'll walk you through it very briefly through Google Earth. A climate analog is where you look at your location, and based on your latitude and your distance, I'm going to take off the historical imagery so we get a better picture here. So in Albeda, which I'm zooming out of, we're right around, I think it's 23 degrees north of the equator, all right? So when I make a climate analog, I look across at the same latitude, both north and south of the equator, and then I drive around the planet with Google Earth and I look at other locations that are very similar to my site in terms of elevation, in terms of rainfall, in terms of, I know that because it's the same latitude that the sun patterns are going to be very similar. So for instance, here's my site in Albeda, and along the same latitude, there's a site in India that's very similar. So I did a study on trees coming out of India along the same latitude. And then Mauritania on the other side of Africa, also very similar climate. And so I could look at what are the ancient agricultural systems in Mauritania? What do people grow there for their food crops? Okay. I've also got a match in Namibia down in here. It's 23 degrees latitude south. Also very similar climate, very similar soil profile, very similar latitude when I'm going at distance from the ocean. So I can look at Namibian tree crops and Namibian systems of growing food. So other matches I found for my climate analog, I also had matches along Baja, Mexico, and also in Australia. So then I can look at all these places, all these different agricultural systems in Namibia, in Mauritania, in India, in Australia, in Baja, and I look at species that are really useful out of these places, and then I can bring them and start to grow a system, and you can be pretty sure that they're going to function there. Okay, so the Pithecolobium dulce that we're growing in Albeda, that's a Mexican tree. The Moringa oleifera that we're growing, I know that it grows in that same latitude in India, where they get a little bit more water, but otherwise it's about the same. And it's growing pretty well where we are. The loquats that we're going to plant come out of Australia. Or at least we know that they grow in Australia at the same, along the climate analog. So when you build a climate analog, it gives you a good idea of what kind of species you can expect to survive and produce where you are, okay? That's the climate analog. And if you want to read more about it, you can go check it out on my blog. All right, the next key is timing. And there's not much more to say to this except for this. Most deserts flood, and most drylands flood, and typically that flooding happens in the wintertime. So my pattern is, in the summer we do earthworks because we know we're not going to get flooded out. And then we plant just before winter. And the reason we're doing this is because I don't want to be caught up in a mountain when it floods, because it's dangerous, and I'm responsible for a lot of people. But also because if you're doing something up in a dry arroyo or a wadi or a dry river valley, and you're not completed before it rains, chances are that's going to get washed out and you're going to lose all that work. And second off, if you plant in the summer, likelihood is those plants are going to die. So that whole saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the next best time to plant is today, that's not true in a desert. You've got to time it right in a desert or else stuff is going to die from heat. All right, the next key is creating microclimates. And this is how I define a microclimate. A microclimate is a very small area where various climatic factors are altered by your design such that it creates a nucleus of life and fertility and growth. And the picture here is of a check dam. This is uphill of the check dam. And this check dam caught all that silt in a flood. Before that check dam was built, the bottom of this picture was just solid rock. It was all stone. But the flood ran up against our check dam and caught all this silt, as well as some grass seed. And so because of the dam and because of the design of how we worked with this flood, this is now a microclimate where grass can grow, whereas before it would not have grown. And that grass very slowly is going to start to alter the kind of biological systems going on there. Okay? So creating a microclimate in practice is not that hard. You're dealing with water, you're dealing with eliminating evaporation, you're dealing with your tree systems or the species you've selected. The great thing about a microclimate, if you're doing it right, is if your design is based on a fractal. And if your design occurs within a fractal, then as your microclimate develops, it's going to be able to multiply and create numerous other, replicate microclimates. Because we know that fractals are the same regardless of their size, whether it's tiny or whether it's gigantic, it's the same pattern. So if your pattern fits within, or if your design fits within that fractal in a particular way, then it can scale up. And if it can scale up and you provide the right kind of design that allows this thing to be self-replicating, then that it can expand to fill the whole fractal, within the limits of your creativity and the resources at hand. Whether the limit to those resources is how little water you get, or the kinds of funding you've got, or the political realities, or your land boundary. So creating your microclimate in a way that fits within these fractals allows you to create something that's going to self-replicate and scale up on its own within the boundaries of that system. Okay, so our final principle here, our final key is enabling ecological succession. And when we talk about ecological succession, it's multiple systems that are functioning together as a whole, and you've got to be cognizant of all of them and trying to encourage all of them to develop together. And they are self-reinforcing. So once you get it all going, once it's all together, you create this upward spiral of life creating more life. So with water, the general principle is slow it down, direct it to where you want it to go by shaping the land and managing runoff. And if you've got excess because the water input is too intense over a certain amount of time, you try to get as much into the ground as you can. Okay, and Brad Lancaster's work has been instrumental in how I approach this, and the way he says it is plant the rain. All right, if you're not familiar with Brad Lancaster's work, I highly, highly recommend it. Okay, so that's a general principle for water. And I'll give you a look of how we planted the rain on our site. So this is looking at that same berm where you saw those trees in that previous picture. And here's what it looked like before we had planted anything, okay? You can see there's no trees here except for a few that are up there. And so we've caught this water off of the floods. And when this happened, some of that water evaporated. I mean, you can see the wind blowing across it, okay? And excuse my shoddy camera work, please. But a lot of this water is going to sink into the ground and go into our shallow aquifer, okay? Whereas if we did not have this water harvesting system, that water would just run by us in a flood and no one would be able to use it. It would be lost to the system and it would extend itself out over the desert and more of it would evaporate, to be honest. Because our percolation rate when the water is rushing over is very, very low. Okay, and you can see that there's excess water running underneath this big dam, but it's still on a fairly flat area. That water is going to sink in, okay? We're going to harvest that water. And after we've harvested that water, then we can go back to that picture I showed you before with all those trees that are now growing there, okay? I'm going to fast forward this a bit. So now that the water's there, we can put in the biological systems. And as those develop, more and more of this water sinks in. And that's the general principle. Okay? A crucial part of restoring desert lands to productivity is the mycelial network. Now, mycelium is a fungal network underneath the ground that cooperates with tree systems. And this has been called nature's internet, and we don't have enough time or space to go into this now, but mycelium and fungi are main drivers of ecological succession, as well as a major indicator of developing soil life. And the better your mycelium network is, the healthier your plants are going to be, all right? So this summer was the first summer that we had rain in Albeda in my 5 years there. It's never rained in the summertime until this year. And when we were walking through the system to check it out, we saw this new species of mushroom that we haven't seen before. And none of the men working for us recognized this type of mushroom either. As far as we know, this was a new species showing up, okay? And you can tell that it's in a mulched area because you can kind of see the straw. But this was a new species that we hadn't seen before in our 5 years of working here. All right. This is another new one that showed up after those rains. And it looks to be affiliated with this ground cover that's there. And this is the third one that we saw. We saw multiple versions of this guy. And he seems to be affiliated with acacias. So this summer, we saw 3 new species of mushroom that we hadn't seen before. And we had seen a different type before every time it had rained. And last year, I was at a conference with Paul Stamets. who is perhaps the world's top expert in mushrooms and fungi on the planet right now. And when I showed him the mushrooms we had, he said, these are a symbol, these are a sign that you have a mycelial network that's developing and that your site is undergoing ecological succession, which means that it is in the process of moving from being a desert to being something else, whether that is a savanna or whether it's a forest or whether we just call it a productive landscape. It's a system that is harvesting water, creating the conditions for the mycelial network to develop, which in turn allows for the tree systems to live and to be productive and to grow soil and to produce soil and to support animal systems. Okay? Now, as that develops, you get more biodiversity moving onto the site. Desert insects are really useful because most of them are burrowers, and what they do is they take organic matter underground where there's more moisture, and so insects can be major soil builders, at least in the initial, not major soil builders in terms of volume that they produce, but in terms of getting that process underway, they can be a very big deal. Okay? Trees are kind of the apex of this because trees manage their own hydrology. They increase precipitation and they decrease evaporation. And so they're kind of the keystone for the whole thing. The mycelium and the soil biology are there so that we can get these trees set up. But once the trees are set up and living and stable, you get massive hydrological effects in terms of groundwater, but also when you get it on a big enough system, you start to change the amount of dust in the atmosphere. You start to change the amount of tree-based aerosols and other volatile organic compounds in the atmosphere. So you actually start creating the conditions that clouds need to form and that rain needs to fall, okay? And then for animal systems, aside from, you know, the animals that you're looking for an economic productive purpose, there are some animals that have key ecological functions whose impact acts as a multiplier for increasing biodiversity. So an example of that is our bat cave. This is a bat cave that we built over the last 3 months. We completed it 2 weeks ago, which would have been, you know, the second week of November of 2015. And this is in an indent. There are mountains on both sides of this, but there was an indent, so we hollowed it out a bit and built this artificial cave, and then we buried it, kind of earthship style. So there's sand up to the top layer of that stone that you can see, and you can also see a little vent pipe coming out of there, all right? So the week after we finished this, after we buried it, I was checking it the night I took this photo, and there was a bat sleeping, hanging from the rough plastered roof of this artificial cave, which is awesome because bats are tremendously helpful in our climate. Bats that we have eat mosquitoes and flies, which we don't like, and they turn those mosquitoes and flies into a tremendously useful agricultural input, which is their manure. It's the bat guano. Bat guano is tremendously valuable in improving soil. And because we now have a bat cave, you know, we can attract a few thousand bats to live on our site, and they're going to eliminate flies and mosquitoes. They're not going to eliminate them, but they're going to decrease the amount we've got. And then every couple of years, we can go in and collect that guano, and then we have this massive agricultural input that's very valuable, and we get it for free by creating habitat for these bats in a place where there's lots of flies and mosquitoes. And so there are, by identifying key species that can perform this kind of role for you, it can help you a great deal in collecting the kinds of inputs you need to assist in this ecological succession you're going after. All right, so that's our bat cave. I'm very, very proud of that. And I'm hoping that that little bat I saw last week, that he brings thousands of his friends and family. Other potential animal systems, ants. There are some species of ant that are known to farm fungi. Ants, there are some ants that grow fungi in their ant hills to be fed to the queen. All right, that's not all types, so that, of course, that needs more research, but they also aerate the soil and they carry organic matter down there. Termites can be very useful, but not if you have a wooden house. So you got to be careful with attracting termites. Our headquarters is, we only have wood in our door frames. So I'm trying to get termites on our site in Albeda. In the desertifying area, you might be able to get earthworms, but not in a true desert. Because the heat and the dryness of the soil just they can't live there. Pigeons can be very useful, both as a food, but also they eat agricultural pests. Some of the pigeons we have, they eat locusts and they eat grasshoppers. So that can be very useful. Encouraging burrowers who can help increase your water soakage, as well as increase your soil organic matter. But the goal behind all of this is to increase the frequency of your nutrient cycle, increase the biodiversity on your site, so that you can have a system that harvests water, builds soil, and evolves into a resilient ecology. All right? So these are my 10 keys to converting a desert into a productive landscape. You've got to know your original climate. You've got to know your water and your mineral cycles. You've got to find the niche in your watershed. You've got to know where you are within your watershed so that you can harvest whatever water you've got available. You've got to understand how precipitation and evaporation work against each other and take anti-evaporative measures. You've got to have good selection of species, good timing, so that you can start creating microclimates that are self-replicating, so that you can be on your way to enabling ecological succession and an ecologically sustainable site system. All right? So that's the first episode of the Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm Neal Spackman. You can write me at neal@twovisionspermaculture.com. That's also the blog that I write on. We have a Facebook group dedicated to dryland restoration that you are welcome to join. And you can follow our project at instagram.com/Albeda. The next live webinar we're going to have is going to be in early January 2016. We have some really, really interesting scenarios. We've got some really cool people who do amazing work that I haven't gotten them to sign the contract yet, so I'm not going to tell you who they are. But if you're interested in doing this kind of work, of building sustainable systems, please join us on sustainabledesignmasterclass.com, and we'll be sending out announcements and newsletters and making other kinds of opportunities available to folks. And that ends it. Now let's go. I'm going to switch back. You're going to have a wonky screen, and then we're going to do some Q&A. All right? So thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful. And let's go back to, here we go. Hi, everybody. So, okay, an example of good designs based on, we're going to start with, is this Neil Bertrando, by the way? This Neil who asked about fractal patterns leading to self-replication? That's our first question. Yeah. Thanks, Raleigh. So within the watershed, we already talked about how the watershed, okay, cool. We already talked about how every watershed follows the same pattern as a fractal. Okay, so whatever you do within a watershed, if you can get it to self-replicate along that, then you're going to be able to duplicate that. So a good example that I can show you is on Google Earth. let's go back to screen share. And I'm going to take it back into Google Earth, and we're going to look at some of these sites. So one fractal that we can talk about are wave patterns. Wave patterns are a fractal. And so one of the ways we patterned our swales, hold on, I've got to find our site. Here we go. All right, so here's the site we've been working on. One of the things about being on contour is that you also duplicate a wave pattern. And so within this wave, if I can create a microclimate of a tree that's going to live off of the water caught in that swale, and it gets to a point where it's self-sustaining, it's going to drop that seed somewhere within that same swale in all likelihood. And the next time there's water in there, that seed is either going to be planted or it's going to be, you know, it could potentially be blown somewhere else or planted somewhere else. But if it lands within another wave, okay, then it's going to pop up next to a swale. So it's going to self-replicate along those lines because our swales also happen to follow a wave fractal. All right? That makes sense? And let's go back. Let's get rid of the wonky screen. Okay. Jill said, I saw rock lines on contour between swales. Those were for, our swales run in a typical north-south pattern. So on the western side of these swales, we tended to put rock buns as a way to shade the initial saplings from the western sun. All right, so those, and then the other thing is that the west is also the uphill side of that swale, so it helps to manage sheet flow coming from in between the swales. Is those rocks on contour help manage the flow so that the bank of our swale doesn't erode quite as quickly. Eventually those swales are going to find their natural angle of repose. But with that, those rocks along the western side, it's going to happen more slowly and not quite as erosively. How long it takes to make a self-funding site in the desert? Where in our climate, where our evaporation rate is about 3,000 millimeters per year, and our precipitation is hovering around 70 millimeters per year, we expect that the ROI of our system, the return on investment, is a 30 to 40 year process. On the other hand, the flip side of that is I don't know of anyone else working in a site as extreme as ours is. So in an easier site, it's going to be less time. Is the original climate of a site going to be our ultimate guide for working with the land, even considering climate change and the effect microregions are having? Not necessarily. I mean, the original climate of where I am was a dryland savanna. But because of where we are in between a mountain system and a sea, there's only about 40 kilometers between our mountains and our sea. And what that means is the major floods out of the big watersheds where we are, about 80% of that water runs into the sea. So if we can manage that water better, we could actually convert this narrow neck of land between the mountains and the sea into a full-blown forest. Because the floods coming out of these watersheds there's so much water in it that isn't being put to a productive use. It's just running into the sea. So it depends entirely on your context. Your original climate is not necessarily the ultimate potential of your site. Because just as people are capable of destroying an entire ecosystem, we're also capable of, through proper design and proper management, we can take destroyed ecosystems and turn them into something even better than what they were originally. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to do here. Marie asked about distance between swales. We planned our swales so that the distance between them was equal to the height of a mature canopy tree. So one of our canopy trees is the mongongo, which can reach 30 meters tall as a mature tree. And we tried to space our swales 20 meters apart so that the shade from our canopy would reach from swale to swale, so that we get full canopy covering our site. That's like a 40-year process. But eventually we get to that point where it's entirely shaded, temperature is much lower across the whole site because our canopy trees are covering everything, even between the swales. Okay? Can these delicate desert systems be made robust and resilient enough to begin exporting the products of the system? Paul, we're 5 years into answering that question, but we are producing honey that we're selling. It's acacia honey, and it sells for about $120 per kilo. We are producing moringa oil. We'll have that in 1 year. It's off of Moringa peregrina, which is actually native to the Arabian Peninsula. So we'll be producing that oil to sell. We'll be producing mongongo oil to sell. Our grazing system is part of the biodegradation that we need to have. When we have grasses show up after rainfall, we need grazing animals to help assist with the biodegradation of that. But then those animals don't have to stay in the system. We can sell them, or at least a portion of them. Would land imprinting techniques work in my area? No, because our climate is super rocky. We're not loose sand. We're very, very rocky. So imprinting you can't imprint on a rock. It's the same reason why hoof action from the Alan Savory techniques of using grazing animals isn't going to work the same here, because it's so rocky that you can't really imprint on it. When creating a series of check dams and fractal gullies, you always start at the top. Marilyn, you always start at the top, because if you're in the bottom and you get a flood, it's just going to destroy the work you did. Whereas if you start at the top and work your way down, your lower ones are protected by the higher ones. Okay, and so in doing that, you still have to size your check dams properly. You still have to look at how much water is going to be hitting that check dam at a time, and then you're looking at just pressure. What's the bar that your check dam can absorb? Benoit, yes, Alan Savory's holistic grazing. I use holistic management on a daily basis in terms of how I make decisions. Okay, holistic management in terms of a decision-making process is something that I very much endorse. But the idea of using grazing animals to turn a true desert back into productivity, I don't believe will function. Because you saw the video of our site when we first started. There was nothing there, right? And we went 3 years without rain. So there's nothing to eat. So if we had just brought, however many heads of camels or goats or sheep, which is what people use here, they would have died from lack of food and lack of water. Because you can't grow grass on animal urine. You need regular rainfall. So I believe as a decision-making process, it's absolutely essential in terms of using only grazing animals as a way to turn back the desert. In desertifying grasslands, yes, it works, and it's been proven to work, and I have lots of colleagues who are using it and swear by it. But in a climate like mine, it's too extreme to introduce animals off the bat, because the animals aren't going to have anything to eat. Let's see. Ooh, we got a lot of questions here. Okay, will our productivity ratio change in the future, or do I expect it to change? That's a great question, Greg. as the system develops, it's going to expand on its own, both up the wadi, up the dry riverbed, through seed dispersal coming from birds, and through us manually planting along a series of check dams. Okay, so yes, that productivity ratio can change as the system develops, because as the system develops, its water requirements actually decrease. It becomes more self-sustaining. The evaporation goes down. And the trees, as they practice something called hydraulic redistribution, the trees can pump water underground on their own through tap roots. And as they do that more and more, you're catching more and more water. And at the same time, the trees are maturing, so they don't need as much irrigation as they did as saplings. So yeah, the productivity expands at the speed of nature. Okay. Ruben, why swales on contour and not in key line? We considered doing key line, but the problem with where we are is that if we had sloped it along a key line pattern, if we had done swales not on contour but along a key line pattern, the water running through those swales would have destroyed the end of the swale, because the shock from the flood is so strong, and the intensity of that rainfall is so intense that the system has to be on contour to be able to absorb that kind of shock. All right, because if you're directing the water in one direction or another, it's going to overrun whatever you've got down there. It could be possible to design it so that your overflow is at the end of a key line organized swale, which I feel hesitant to use that phrase in the first place. But then how do you get that back? The other issue with key line is that we don't want water to go to our ridges, because our ridges are solid stone. Okay, so within a wadi, where we are, our ridges are just stone. So it's a nonsensical idea to try to direct water to the ridge, because we don't get enough water to spread it out to the ridges. What we want to do is we want to get that water, we want to slow it down, and we want to get it into the ground. But diverting it to the ridges doesn't do that, because the ridges are just stone. Okay? Yes, we've never used pesticides. We've never used neonics. We've never used anything. We've used no biocides whatsoever, ever. Okay. Sean, can I speak to soil inputs and amendments as it relating to moisture retention and fertility? Yeah, the bigger you get, the harder it is to intensively manage this. So if you're working on a small system, it's easy to create, an amount of biochar, to do a foliar spray, or but on a system this big, the bigger you get, the harder it is to do that in an efficient way, especially because I'm working with people who aren't familiar with these systems. So yes, it works to the extent that we've used it. It's been helpful, but I'm trying to be less intensive with our management. I'm hoping that we can do this using Mark Shepard's stun technique, which is strategic total neglect, right? I'm hoping to get things more passive rather than more intensively managed, even if that means a drop in our productivity in the start. But for someone working on a smaller system, or for someone interested in managing it more intensively, I think it's been shown that biochar, that foliar sprays, those kinds of things, or compost, are very useful and very effective. Let's see here. Do we have any advice on working with those who have land or acquiring land for demonstration sites? How do we work with farmers actively desertifying their land? This is a really interesting question that we're going to bring up in a future webinar, because in Saudi Arabia, I haven't worked with other farmers. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, they're cutting all the agricultural subsidies for grains and for alfalfa because they've realized that they're draining the aquifers. So there are entire farming communities here that are in major shock and are facing major collapse. So it's where I am now, it's almost self-evident that typical farming cannot continue. And so it's not self-evident that what we're doing in Albeda is the solution, but when we present it to people, then they realize that the utility of what we're doing, especially in the long term. So those who have land or are trying to acquire land for demonstration sites, it depends entirely on your context. We should talk about that offline on a different webinar. Eric, 7 inches of rain per year and 75 to 90 growing days. I don't know what the question is yet, but sounds like a cool site. Sounds like a challenging scenario. I brought up biochar. Wouldn't it help to put temporary swales with nurse trees in between for the first 20 years? It could help, except that the way that we've got them spaced also helps with the sheet flow coming off of that land. We could potentially do more swales more closely, but when we were first, the limit on that was actually finances. The limit on what we could do in terms of our earthworks was limited by what we had the funds to do at the time. Thank you, Becky, for the love. I love you too. How do we manage overflow of the swales? Okay, all of your earthworks need to have a planned overflow. Everything needs a planned overflow. From the top of your watershed till the water exits your site, you need to plan where overflow is going to happen because it's going to happen regardless. So we have where the flood or where the water runs and where that intersects with our earthworks, we have a series of dams there that divert water into the swale without that swale silting up too much. And that same place is also the overflow. So the swale along this, it fills up here and then it goes to the next one, and then it fills up there and then it goes to the next one, and then it fills up there. So all of your earthworks should have an overflow. Because if you don't have a planned overflow, it's going to overflow somewhere else where you don't want it to happen. Okay? Sherry, we are still trying to plant some Morris species. We are planting some Mongongo, and we may be planting some more Moringa. We have the water budget for it after this summer, but I want to see if it rains this winter. Okay? So, Eric, do you have suggestions? I already use a micro swale on contour, but don't seem to capture enough water for trees. So that sounds like a watershed issue where you need to figure out how much water is being collected based on your percolation rate and your runoff coefficient. And then that will help you determine what your water budget is and what kind of things you can grow. All right. So unless we have more questions, I'm going to say thank you all for coming. I've enjoyed this because I like talking about myself and my work. And I hope it's been useful for you wherever you may be on in your step to working in deserts. Okay, I haven't used Growaces for starting trees because they're expensive, and I'm trying to get a lot of trees. I understand that they work, but I've never used them. Okay, Stefan, any idea what to do in a completely plain area? Yes, reshape your land so that you know how much water is going where, and then that square of area or that shape of area you've got, that's your water budget. Direct that water where you want it to go, and then figure out what you can grow based on that water budget. Okay. Thank you all very much. Good luck in your work. Please join us on Sustainable Design Masterclass because we're going to be doing some awesome stuff. And we'll be in touch. Take care, everybody. I'm signing out.